All right. I think we're good to go. The BCM internet is not good today. We're going to try. So, this week is about dating and singleness, which is a super fun topic. And really, my goal this week is to it'd be really easy, I think, to be like, well, here's what you need to think about with dating. Here's what you need to think about singleness. And we'll do some of that. But really, what I want to do when I'm talking, I'm going to kind of point to some, I think, cultural misconceptions about what dating should look like from a godly perspective that maybe we've kind of taken on ourselves. And then also some of the things that the church says with regard to dating and singleness that maybe have been influenced by the culture. I think one of the lies we need to point out when we're thinking about dating is this lie of like, well, make sure you figure yourself out first um, before you kind of commit to anything. And you'll hear on Thursday kind of what I mean by that. But the kind of, if you get down to brass tacks, a lot of times we can make relationships all about us. Like, I want to find someone that fits in with me and like really complements my life. Whereas the Bible talks about how marriage relationships, which are the benchmark when we're thinking about dating, it talks about how those relationships are about mutual sacrifice and submission to one another and this kind of being molded by the other person instead of saying, well, let me find someone that just fits well with me. Because that's a more self-focused way. We do this with our career and how we want to do this. We do this with our lifestyle and cohabitating, the way we think about like sexual relationships. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then another one where we need to learn when to step away from relationships or when it's okay to say no. Because the other part of it is singleness. And singleness culture is weird. Like there's some cultural and church messages that basically say like being in a relationship, being married, that's the epitome of human life and meaning and fulfillment. But we're going to look at some passages that really say otherwise and really challenge that perspective. Um, and there's some passages that say, or some kind of cultural conceptions that say, well, you don't want to be tied down in a relationship. You want to be free. And the Bible speaks against that too. It talks about how as single people, the goal is not like, I'm just going to do whatever I want. It's to like love and serve the Lord. You have more freedom to do that in different ways. And so I think this is going to be super challenging. I hope it is, because I think there's a lot of mess and mixed up messages. I'm going to walk quickly through the passages, okay? Both sections, dating and singleness. I'm going to open with, what does popular culture communicate about dating, and is there any truth in that ideas? We don't just want to say like, well, culture is trash. We want to say like, what's the truth, what's not the truth, and then what does the church communicate about dating or singleness, and is there anything unhealthy in those? Sometimes the church can accidentally take on things from the culture that are not biblical, and we want to be careful that we're analyzing everything through the lens of Scripture. So the first passage I have you guys looking at with dating is Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5 is one of the best like pictures of marriage because it talks about how we lay down our lives for one another. It's about mutual submission, how both people in a relationship are supposed to kind of lay down their life for the other person. And so, how do these verses about marriage shape the way we think about dating? Is this someone I'm willing to lay my life down for? Is this person of high character? Does this person love the Lord? Are they going to point me to Jesus in our relationship? Talking about things like this. I see here the dating is meant to figure out, I just said this. So yeah, what do we think is important? If those are our metrics of whether or not we're deciding to date someone, or to pursue someone and maybe think about having a dating relationship or stay in a relationship, like what is most important? What should we be considering if Ephesians 5 is our foundation? And then I also have you looking at Philippians 2, 3, and 4, which is just about all relationships, how in those relationships we're supposed to think of one another more we think of the other more highly than we ought because Jesus models that for us. But the thing is, how do you balance this idea of compatibility with the call to serve one another? So, because the trick is, you don't want to get in a relationship where you're just going, well, the Bible told me I'm supposed to lay down my life for this person. Maybe I'm miserable, but it's fine. I'm supposed to serve them and submit to them. It's like, okay, well, how do we balance that with needing to say, like, no, I'm not compatible with this person, or I might love them. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you hear and see like people in relationships and they still, have affection for the person, but it's like, but this isn't right, you know? And so how do we figure that out? How do we figure out what that looks like? I hope that's a good conversation for you to have. And then at the end, after discussing these things, what do you think are characteristics of healthy Christian dating relationships, and what are some red flags? So I hope you guys can flesh that out together. Now, with regard to singleness, the first passage I have you looking at is Matthew 19. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is read Matthew 19 and be ready to set it up for them and kind of give them some context, because I'm kind of having you come in to verse 10. Otherwise, it's going to feel like it's out of nowhere. So be ready for that. The passage is mostly about divorce. But then Jesus goes on and says this kind of weird thing about eunuchs, which might feel kind of like out of left field. But there's a part in there about people. It's not just eunuchs, like people who are going to be single. It's people who are choosing to be single. And he's basically saying there's some people that choose to be single because the calling of marriage doesn't fit with them, or it's a high calling. Maybe they're like, you know what, I'm going to be single so that I can serve the Lord wholeheartedly. And I'd like, what does that actually look like? Try to be as practical as possible. Like, if someone, hypothetically, if I'm going to choose to be single so that I can serve the Lord, well, that's ambiguous. What does that mean? What does that really look like for someone's life? Maybe you've seen it play out before, so maybe to get a vision for that. And then 1 Corinthians 7 is wild, and that's really why I want to have you look at it. I'm going to have you read verses 7 and 9, and then 25 through 35. And I want to point to a couple things here to help you. Now, Paul is going to sound similar to Jesus here, so I do want you to compare and contrast here. So one thing I want to point out is up in verse, if you look at 7 to 9, he says, I wish all of you were that I am. Each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the married and widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. Paul is going to go on, and he's kind of saying, which is really, this is kind of confusing, but he kind of says, like, now he's almost saying, like, this is my opinion about this, which is a confusing thing to say. I feel like, anyway, that's a whole nother sermon discussion maybe. But he's basically saying there is a time in Paul saying that the time we are in right now, I encourage you all, don't worry too much about your relationship status. Sink into what God has in front of you right now. Now, you could debate, is this for us, our time? Is this just for the Corinthians? Like, how prescriptive is this passage for us? And I think that this is going to be person to person. I really do. Like, some of you are going to say, like, no, what God has called me to right now, I'm not going to get wrapped up in a relationship. God has called me into something, and I'm going to focus on that. If a relationship comes, great. Now, others of you are going to feel more like you need to be in a relationship. And Paul's saying that's fine too. Verse 9 can be a little awkward, but it says, if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And you know what? That verse just says what it says. Nothing to add. But he's basically, I think the way we can take this is like, what has God called you to? Where are you in your life right now? What do you feel like God's calling is on your life? And what is this, if you feel like you can give yourself wholeheartedly to that, Paul's encouraging you to do that. This is far from the church's typical unspoken message that marriage is like the epitome of the Christian life. Paul's saying kind of the opposite here, which is crazy. He talks about a present crisis down in verse 26. And he's, he had this urgency. And so, do you have an urgency in your life? Is there something you feel like is in front of you right now? Um, Now, I want to also point out that he says an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. This is 32. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And there is a practical reality where being married gives you other things to think about. Now, this is not to say, what I want to be careful is not to say that, like, oh, being single is super easy. It's not. I mean, if you look, the question I want you to look at the end is like, what is difficult about being single, especially in the world of the church? There's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of things that are built around families, and single people can feel kind of like excluded from that. And the question I want you to consider is, okay, so if there's this struggle that single people have in the church, how can married people and families be a part of helping alleviate some of that difficulty? And what's the role of a single person in a church to help be more integrated into the life of the church? This is a huge topic. I feel like your small group can go any number of ways, honestly, and I'm here for it. I think you guys try to guide the conversation, help them. I really encourage you to make sure you try to get to both topics. We don't want to. Dating is first because singleness, um, you know. It just made more sense in the way I was thinking through it, but I'm not trying to communicate that singleness is less important. So please make sure you get to it in your time and kind of manage the time that way. I know this is one of my longer videos. I had more to say. Please let me know if you want to chat. I know this is a kind of a huge topic. So let me know, and I'll see you soon.